Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
The story of the UK is an economy that has got real momentum.
What is broken can be repaired. What is ruined can be rebuilt.
UK inflation is becoming much more homegrown.
We have huge potential as an economy in the UK.
This is a time to tell Israel there is a path to peace.
Our plan for the British economy is working, but the work is not done.
I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. Welcome to the programme. Well, Ewan, earlier this week we were talking about the Foreign Secretary David Cameron in North America. Well, today there is a former Foreign Secretary popping up, trying to talk to Conservatives. It's Boris Johnson at the Canada Strong and Free Network conference in Ottawa. Have a listen to what he said.
You know, the difference between us Conservatives and our opponents is that every time their instincts are always about control and expropriation and coercion and taking your money and spending it on your behalf and regulating your lives, and we are on the whole in favor of freedom. And that it's that single Anglo-Saxon idea of freedom that I think unites Conservatives, or should unite Conservatives. And when I look at some of the things that we're doing now, I think that are being done in the name of conservatism, I think they're absolutely nuts. And you know, I see my own beloved party a few months, but you know, we're banning cigars. And what is? I mean, maybe you all think that's a great idea. I just can't see what is the point of banning? Well, the party of Winston Churchill wants to ban. I mean, donnez-moi un break, as they say in Quebec. You know, it's just mad.
Yeah, he's always box office, isn't he? He always has. You can always rely on him for some good one-liners. You rather wonder when one of these big speaking engagements comes up, what the Prime Minister is thinking. Is he thinking, "Oh my goodness, what's he going to say?" But I do get the sense that there's a feeling that Rishi Sunak would like to bring him back into the fold. But he's a loose cannon, isn't he?
Well, yes, but as you say, box office. I mean, I watched almost all of that hour-long discussion with Boris Johnson sitting alongside the former Australian leader Tony Abbott and also the journalist John O'Sullivan. I mean, they didn't shy from the big topics. I mean, I know that the cigar talk was sort of in jest, and that was towards the end of the discussion. But you know, he hit the big Conservative issues and talking points. He talked about the need for more defence spending. So that was the big kind of clue around perhaps him wanting to step into the political fray again. Long answer about Ukraine, about what advice he would give to Mike Johnson, the US Speaker of the House, when it comes to Ukraine. Of course, that was something that David Cameron was meant to be lobbying on the UK's behalf for. He also talked about Israel, you know, and saying that people in the West are falling for it, for sort of Hamas propaganda, and that there needs to be moral clarity. He talked also about his support for net zero, which he disagreed with Tony Abbott on quite vehemently. So, you know, very hard for Johnson to stay out of that political fray and the big topics still today.
Yeah, and interesting. I thought his comments on Ukraine being part of NATO. Of course, that's incredibly controversial, not least with Russia. We know that's one of the things which Vladimir Putin feels most strongly about. So he's very keen to weigh in on these foreign issues. But I think it's when he weighs in on the domestic issues that's when probably the lights flash most keenly in number 10.
Well, it's pithy, isn't it? Banning, the party of Winston Churchill banning the cigar.
And of course
gets attention.
Yeah, that's something that Liz Truss has been very outspoken about as well. So this has clearly hit a certain raw nerve amongst sections of the Conservative Party. Yeah,
absolutely. So that, of course, Boris Johnson in Canada then. Another CPAC, not to be confused with the one that takes place in the US. Boris Johnson. Well, joining us now for more is our UK government reporter, Ellen Milligan. Ellen, great to have you back on the podcast. Now, you'd be forgiven, wouldn't you, for thinking that Boris Johnson was auditioning for Foreign Secretary, listening to those clips of him in Canada. What do you think he was doing?
I mean, this has quickly become quite a common theme for Boris Johnson. It began last month when he flew to Venezuela to meet President Maduro on an unofficial visit. And then last week, ahead of a decision on whether the UK would continue to allow arms sales to Israel, he used a Daily Mail column calling the idea of a ban insane. And now, of course, we've heard him in Canada, where he also, by the way, criticised government domestic policy on phasing out the sale of cigarettes. So we know he's not afraid to step on his colleagues' toes, particularly when it comes to his old frenemy David Cameron, who's now the Foreign Secretary. But I also think this is about preserving his own legacy, especially when it comes to Ukraine, which is what we mostly heard him speak about in Canada. And there's also been reports that Sunak wants to deploy Boris Johnson in an election campaign. So clearly what we're seeing is Boris Johnson itching to get back into the political fray.
You mentioned the Foreign Secretary. It does seem that since David Cameron was appointed, that Rishi Sunak has really retreated to become a purely domestic-focused PM. Do you think that's a deliberate strategy with the election coming up?
I think so. As you say, we've seen, these quite snazzy videos from David Cameron. He's actually received quite a lot of praise for his leadership of the Foreign Office and the kind of leadership he's been showing, for example, on the Israel-Gaza conflict. But I think it's natural in an election year for the Prime Minister to focus more on domestic policy. For Rishi Sunak, he's actually excelled much more in foreign policy. So the Windsor Framework, for example, on Ukraine, on leadership on AI regulation, for example. So it's slightly odd that he's been willing to take that step back, because in the past he has excelled kind of on the world stage rather than domestically. But I think this was always the plan when he appointed David Cameron. It allows him to spend a lot more time in the country, speaking to voters. And really, if you see in the polls, voters care much more about domestic policy and leadership than foreign policy.
Yes, okay, but then there's the rub. I mean, we're 3 weeks away from an election, albeit a local one. You've got the former leader of the party, Boris Johnson, saying that the Conservatives aren't conservative, okay, over specific policies, but being, pretty critical, as you say. Is party unity something that is possible for Sunak to deliver, or is it just too big of an ask?
I think a lot hangs on those May 2nd local elections, and there is talk in Westminster now that if they go as badly as expected or even worse than expected, that Rishi Sunak will have an even greater problem when it comes to the unity within his party. And there is now talk of, will he potentially be forced into a June election rather than the autumn election that the government would prefer? And that's purely because of the management of his party. You saw the honey trap story that's kind of captured Westminster in the last couple of weeks. Something like that, some kind of scandal or a weakness in the government and a weakness in the Conservative Party that may be exploited by a leadership hopeful. They want to do anything to avoid any kind of leadership bids and attempts to oust Rishi Sunak, and that may mean calling an earlier than wanted election.
Ellen, there was a big poll from YouGov last week, terrible for the Conservatives and plenty of negative commentary. And of course, just in the last few months, we've had that increased threat from reform. Do you think that there is anything that the PM can do over the next couple of months to change the narrative?
Well, there are very few optimists left in the Conservative Party, I would say. But the ones that are left, what they've been telling me is that, the polls were wrong ahead of the 2015 election. Ed Miliband was expected to do much better than he did. They were wrong in the lead up to the Brexit referendum, for example. Even on the other turn of the coin, 2017 election, Theresa May was expected to do much better and she lost her majority. And they also point to the economic data. Interest rates are expected to come down. Inflation is expected to meet the 2% target by the end of the year. And so the optimists think that, people will feel better by the time an autumn election will come around. But it's very much a case of preventing the huge amount of losses expected among Conservative seats rather than about winning the election, I would say.
Yeah, okay. But I like the fact that, you're ever so cautious around the polling, the overstating of the possibility of a big loss from the Conservatives. And that does seem to be what a lot of Conservative MPs perhaps and Conservatives themselves are maybe hoping, that the polling is flawed as it has been in other pre-election moments. Look, not to sound alarmist though, do you think that there could be a leadership challenge territory if Sunak does badly in the local elections?
Well, I should also say that, the polling, there's such a big lead that even if, there's a kind of 10-point leeway either side, Labour is still well ahead of the Conservatives. And this is very much the Conservatives like clutching at straws here when it comes to the polling. But yes, there has been talk of, Kemi Badenoch, Penny Mordaunt, Grant Shapps, Robert Jenrick jostling for the leadership. And I think if you take yourself back a couple of years to when Boris Johnson was kind of teetering towards the end of his premiership, it really took one scandal, the Chris Pincher scandal, to allow his rivals in the party to seek a weakness to exploit to oust him, and that is the fear in the government at the moment, is whether they can keep a lid on that for the next 6 to 9 months. Ahead of the kind of last point at which they can call an election. Until then, that you will see these moments like Grant Shapps calling for higher defence spending and slightly going off message in an attempt to kind of position themselves ready for any potential leadership race.
Ellen, well, just 3 weeks until those local elections when we'll get some concrete results from actual elections. That's UK government reporter Ellen Milligan. Thanks so much for joining us. All right, well, let's dive into the detail of those local elections. Joining us now is Labour Together's Director of Research, Christabel Cooper. Now, Christabel, we're just 3 weeks out from those English local elections. Tell us some of the results that you'll be looking out for to show that Labour are making some solid gains.
Well, Labour launched its campaign in Dudley, and there's a reason for that. It's a very heavily Leave voting area. The seat of Dudley North was one of the red wall seats that they lost in the collapse in 2019, and the council is currently no overall control. So Labour will be looking to take places like that back. And in fact, if you look at the last set of local elections, Labour is doing better in those very heavily Leave voting areas that they did so badly in 2019. So we'd definitely be looking at places like that to see them come back to Labour control.
OK, let's nail some colours to the mast then, shall we, in terms of what an actual good result for Labour would be. It's always quite difficult with the May elections, isn't it? You have to think it's not a huge election in terms of the number of seats, as by historic standards. It's 2,600 seats being contested. Labour and the Tories defending just under 1,000 seats each. What would be good for Labour?
Well, we've had some predictions that the Tories are set to lose about 500 seats. I actually think that's a bit toppy. That's based on the fact that in 2021, when the seats were last up, the Tories did pretty well. That was off the vaccine bounce. Seems a long time ago now, but they were riding high in the polls. So they've got further to fall this time. But I think what a lot of people haven't quite appreciated is that out of those 1,000 odd seats that they are defending, only about 700 actually date back to 2021. There's been boundary changes. There's been councils which have moved to having all-out elections rather than electing in one-third. So I would expect that a very bad result for the Tories looks more like losing 350, 300 seats.
OK, so it is an annoyingly complex picture.
Unfortunately, local elections generally are.
This sounds like a particularly bad one. I think these elections are going to be interesting in part because of what they tell us about where Labour's gaining ground. What does your research say about the way that the party's electoral coalition is changing?
So in the last election, we saw the vote split very much on Brexit lines and on lines that, I'm sorry to get a bit geeky here, sort of political scientists would call the socially liberal authoritarian axis. So this is sort of where people's views on things like immigration really matter. And you could see a real divide at the last election where people who were on the socially conservative end of that spectrum tended to have voted Leave, really heavily went for the Conservatives. In this election, obviously, we're in the middle of an economic crisis. I think we expect now that people are going to vote more on economics. They're going to vote more on how they feel about the competence of the last government. So you really have quite a large number of people who are pretty fed up with the way the economy is, with the cost of living crisis, with Partygate, with Liz Truss. So it's a really quite a large coalition of people that stretches across, that stretches across that socially liberal authoritarian divide that really split the vote last time.
So do you expect that divide to really break down this time? Do you think it's going to be a real kind of unwinding of that thing we saw last time?
Absolutely, and that's literally what you see in the last set of local election results, that Labour did better in those Leave voting areas than in fact in Remain voting areas. So it's kind of overcoming the problem that it's had in the last 10 years or so, where its vote is really inefficiently distributed. So it racks up loads of votes in cities like London, but not in the kind of marginal towns where it needs to win. And that really seems to be unwinding now. It's doing better in those Leave voting marginal towns than in the big cities at the moment.
OK, I think that's really interesting. So what clues then for the general election based on this? And I know you do a lot of focus group work also, and you're speaking and engaging with voters. I mean, a good chunk of whom many analysts are concerned are actually quite disengaged, quite fed up. It's been a very difficult time economically for Britain. We're post-pandemic, so many challenges. What sort of flavour of the electorate do you get when you speak to people, so many people, face to face?
Yeah, absolutely. You really, really get a sense of how fed up they are, how hard they are finding things. And that's not just people right at the bottom of the income scale. It's people just above that who are just resenting the fact, quite rightly, that they can't do the things that they used to do, that they can't go on foreign holidays, that they can't eat out like they used to. And they are pretty fed up with that. I mean, we've talked to quite a lot of disengaged voters, and I think what's quite interesting is that they can be quite transactional about party politics. So they're looking for specific things that parties will do for them and their families, rather than being guided necessarily by ideology. So it will come down to, I think, what the parties can offer them at the next general election.
And just staying with focus groups, what are some of the things which the people you speak to say about the Labour Party and about Keir Starmer?
They are a lot less hostile to the Labour Party and to Keir Starmer than they are to Rishi Sunak. But many of them are yet to hear what Labour has to offer them. And I think over the coming months they will hear a bit more of that. But certainly at the moment, the overwhelming feeling is that it's time for a change. Labour has turned itself into a credible opposition, which I don't think it was in 2019. And so people are now saying that they are prepared to look at Labour, that they are prepared to think about voting Labour.
Yeah, and the momentum does definitely seem to be there, doesn't it, when you speak to people in the world of politics? Look, what do you think would sell it then to the voters that you speak to? I mean, is it something specific in terms of tax cuts, in terms of a spending pledge that would actually win over those voters? I mean, for example, I've interviewed Rachel Reeves. We all know that this election is probably going to be fought largely on the economy. Labour has yet to really detail what it's going to do economically. Does there have to be a package of economic measures in order to win those discontents or perhaps disinterested voters who, thinking about what it means for them?
Yeah, I think that's probably true for some of them. But Labour is offering a level of economic stability that I think has been really missing from our economy for the last few years, particularly since obviously Liz Truss's pretty disastrous premiership. And I think Labour are saying the right things about growth. They're saying they're now going big on planning and housing, which I think is something that will not only drive growth but actually be quite popular with a large part of its coalition. I think part of the problem with the Conservatives on housing is that their voter coalition simply won't allow them to do any of those measures. The New Deal for Working People is something that has been, when we talk to people about it, it's really, really popular. people are suffering. My own son is suffering from being on a 0 hours contract at the moment. And I think that really resonates with people, that we need to rebalance that relationship between employers and employees, which can be to the benefit of both, actually. So I think there are things that Labour is saying that I think will resonate with a lot of voters.
We constantly hear from Keir Starmer and the leadership about caution on polling, about complacency. Don't get complacent, don't believe the polls. As somebody who's involved in polling, and you don't work for the Labour Party, but you're closely tied to the Labour Party. What's it like working in that environment? Do you find yourself having to kind of like temper expectations?
Well, the fact that the reason that it's looking like Labour might overturn what was really quite a landslide majority in 2019 in one turn really points to how volatile the electorate is. And I've got to say, I'm quite pleased with myself that I was one of the people, even just post 2019, who did think that Labour could overturn it, simply because I'd seen just how volatile that electorate is. So what really happened in 2019 was that you got a lot of solid Labour voters, not going to being solid Tory voters, but actually just turning into swing voters. You've got a lot more marginal constituencies now than you ever had. All of those red wall seats, which used to be solid Labour, are now just bellwether marginals. So what that means, it's great for Labour at this precise moment, because you've got lots of people who are willing to consider Labour. But, the downside of that is that equally they could flip back. And I think that there's a worry about the number of people who are saying to pollsters that they don't know who they're going to vote for. Most of those are people who voted Conservative in 2019, and headline voting excludes those people. Some pollsters reallocate them, but most pollsters will just pretend that those people aren't going to vote. The likelihood is those people are going to vote, and past elections suggest that they will go back to voting for the party that they voted for last time around, which in most cases is the Conservatives. So I think there is still quite a lot of caution that we should apply to looking at those headline voting figures. The electorate is really volatile. And just, you look at the 2017 general election campaign. Now, admittedly, some of those predictions that the Tories were 20 points ahead were probably a polling error. But you can really see how those polls narrowed during that election campaign. And, Labour went from the worst local election results in a decade to the best general election result in a decade, obviously still lost. But you can see just over a matter of weeks that Tory lead really collapsed, in part because of mistakes like, for example, announcing the dementia tax. So in that kind of environment, you can really see why Labour is urging caution. If we make a mistake during the campaign, that could really cost us in the way that it cost Theresa May.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fascinating, the idea that the population is so volatile. It goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the programme, Yuan, about Boris Johnson, how in that whole speech that he gave, this idea of safetyism came up, how the population in the UK and Conservative populations in different countries, Canada and Australia, reacted so unexpectedly to the pandemic crisis, that actually they backed a lot of kind of intervention and authoritarianism in a lot of places. And that was really unexpected. I find that so interesting. On the other hand, does it not make you want to be a great deal bolder? With 30 points up in the polls, the Labour Party, is going to have to be bold to grab those votes.
Well, I'd go back again to looking at that 2017 election campaign. It's just very easy to do something that really, really turns the public against you very, very quickly. And I think in that volatile environment, you can see if you are, 20 points ahead in at least the headline polling, why you wouldn't want to risk that.
We've talked a lot of times on the show about how the Conservatives have a problem in that they're facing two very different directions. So they've got to defend their red wall and they've got to kind of hold on to their seats in the home counties. And those are two very different electorates. But Labour's also got that problem, hasn't it? So as well as looking to grab those red wall seats, maybe you think they're already in the bag, but Labour's also trying to win very different places in the South and the Midlands, your Worcesters and your Stevenages and these other small towns, and they're very different, aren't they?
They are very different, but people are facing many of the same problems at the moment. I mean, as I kind of referenced earlier, it's pretty much everyone is being affected by the cost of living crisis. Even people on middle income incomes are being affected by it. And, every month we've got more and more mortgage holders who are having to remortgage on higher rates, and that will hit their income. So there is actually, I think, quite a, there's a lot of similar experiences that very different people are having that I think is prompting them to move towards Labour. And just in general, if you look at public opinion, people overall do want greater state intervention, especially at the moment. They are in favour of, for example, the government intervening, the government having an industrial strategy. The creation of GB Energy is one of Labour's most popular policies. And it's actually kind of quite surprising that even sort of people who might even think of themselves as centre-right will agree with a lot of those policies.
Yeah, that's so interesting, isn't it? So then maybe 2019, it was Brexit that was the kind of pivot point. Now, is it the cost of living crisis that is that pivotal issue, or is it something else? Because everybody's trying to figure out, is it going to be an election on the economy, or is it going to be on NHS or crime, for example, in London, or planning for housing or immigration for some other voters? What's the pivot point for voters, do you think, now?
Yeah, I mean, every single poll shows that the cost of living is the top issue for most voters, followed by the NHS. Immigration often comes third. And I think the problem for the Conservatives, though, is that amongst their core vote, immigration is a bigger issue. But amongst the population in general, it's definitely a second-tier issue behind those two first issues. And, the really big problem the Tories have on immigration is that they're losing a lot of the people who should be at the absolute core of their coalition because they are so concerned about immigration but feel that the Tories have really failed on it. So it's actually splitting their vote much more than it splits the Labour vote, which is basically more concerned with the cost of living and the NHS.
Oh, fascinating conversation looking at some of the things that Labour will be focusing its sights on as we approach the general election. That's Christabel Cooper, Labour Together's Director of Research. Thank you.
Well, wasn't that a fascinating conversation then with Christabel Cooper? Look, I think that there is muted excitement in the Labour camp, trepidation. I think it's really interesting that Christabel Cooper talked about an industrial strategy for the UK, how much she sees Labour voters as wanting to see, a better deal for the cost of living crisis and for workers and employees in the UK.
Yeah, and you really get a sense that there's a debate in the Labour Party, a central debate over how bold to be.
Yes.
I think over how bold to be and how upfront to be about that boldness as well, about how much to talk about before the general election, because there's always a danger of policies getting pinched, of upsetting people. So I think that's a central question, isn't it, at the moment? Yeah,
and the clock is ticking. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Walcock and our audio engineer was Sean Gostamachia. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.